Welcome back to another Pearl Lemon Legal YouTube video. Now today we're going to be discussing how to evict a residential tenant with a few caveats. So we might do another video at a later stage just on how to evict a residential tenant. Today we're going to be focusing on a very specific case that we worked on some time ago, earlier this year, where we helped someone evict a tenant on universal credit who's in Wales. Now those two complications added to a bit of a headache for our client prior to engaging with us. And so we're going to walk through some of the pitfalls, things you can avoid. I think one of the first things to point out, and this is part of the process, is identifying the jurisdiction that your tenant is in. So there's a different process in England, there's a different process in Wales. Now, there wasn't always, there's a different process in Scotland. So bearing that in mind, most of our clients are in England. However, every now and again, we have a client who's trying to evict a tenant and they don't fall under one of those jurisdictions. And that's the first thing we ask is which process have you followed, because the different ones do exist. The second thing is you need to identify or review your tenancy agreement, the agreement that you have in place with your tenant, and you need to know what state it's currently in. So our tenant had served a notice that wasn't relevant for a few reasons, the jurisdiction being one. But the other reason was the tenant was no longer on an assured short-haul tenancy, but instead was on a periodic rolling tenancy. The AST had expired, and so by default, it had become periodic rolling tenancy. And that added to added a bit to the complication. So then you need to establish the basis that you're going to be evicting the tenant on. Is it a lack of rent paid? Is it a no-fault eviction? In most cases, it is a no-fault eviction, and that's the process we followed in this case. And then you want to make sure that you're serving the correct notice. So we'll go through a few of those notices as well in a moment. I think one of the things that made this case so unique was that due to a rule change just towards the end of December 2022, the tenant needed to be moved from the rolling periodic tenancy to a new form of rolling periodic tenancy. What our client had not been aware of was this change, and also that he needed to serve a notice that was relevant to him being in Wales. So he had served a Section 21 notice. It turned out he needed to serve a Section RHW17, which is really just the Welsh version of the Section 21 notice, without overcomplicating things. However, before that RHW17 could be served, the tenant needed to be converted from a rolling periodic tenancy to a formalized periodic tenancy, so that that form could be, or so that that notice could be served. Now, we've discussed some of the complications. The complications that existed here was that the tenant was on universal credit, which means that the courts are going to look at the situation in a more favorable way, even if you are a private landlord rather than a council housing landlord, as well as the fact that the laws had changed. Now, the different kinds of notices you get in England are the Section 21, which is the no-fault notice. Typically, you would give 2 months notice. However, if the contract required more, 3 months, it does happen, then you would have to give 3 months, even though you were still serving a Section 21 notice. The Section 8 notice is served when more than 2 months rent arrears are, or there have been more than 2 months rent arrears, and the RHW17 is specifically for a periodic tenancy holder in Wales. And that also has a minimum of 2 months notice. Now, in this case, once we had converted the tenancy and served the RHW17, we then had to wait 2 months so that a hearing would be scheduled. Now, in this case, the tenant had every intention of leaving, but didn't want to leave without having been allocated an alternative form of council housing. That was brought up at the hearing, and through that process, the courts were able to reallocate housing for the tenant. And so, while in most cases the defense would be considered, the claim would be considered, in this case it was a much more straightforward process. Now, finally, that eviction process, instead of involving bailiffs, involved the courts identifying alternative council housing, as we've discussed. So a very unique case, and I think the reason we found it necessary to do this video is just to highlight that even though evictions can seem like a very standard process, once you enter into the eviction process, your unique situation might change dramatically what it is that you need to do. And that really was purely the purpose of today's video. All right, that was how to evict a residential tenant who's on universal credit. Full disclosure, we would recommend contacting ourselves or another professional if you are looking at doing it, just because in this case, I think our client started the process in June or May or June of 2022. And by the beginning of, or rather by April of 2023, after engaging with us, he was able to properly start the process. And so that's why we would recommend rather get in touch with someone who has done it before, has access to the right information, and that way you can just save yourself a lot of time and headaches. We hope you enjoyed that video. Please, if you did, like and subscribe, and we'll see you on another video shortly.